Hi students, this week we'll be talking about controllers and routing. Um, the book kind of throws a lot of stuff at you all at the same time at the beginning to get you familiar with the framework and also to throw a lot of concepts at you all at the same time just to see what sticks. And then after that, we're starting to go through the chapters now that really take a deep dive into everything that's kind of thrown at you there at the beginning. So this chapter covers controllers and routing, so it's how our URLs map to our controllers and our actions that exist on our controllers, as well as how we can pass information into those routes as well. So what I'm going to do is just cover the high points of this PowerPoint, and then we're going to go into Visual Studio and discuss exactly what all of this means. So as you can see, the objectives for this chapter, we're going to try to configure the routing for an ASP.NET Core MVC web app and develop controllers that work with the URLs. So we're going to be using our URLs to put information into our actions as well as describe our actions that we'll be using and have those correlate to the URLs that we build. So if we remember at the beginning of the course, some of the students asked me questions. They said, I keep going to these URL actions and that they don't work. It keeps instead giving me hello world. So a piece of code that we're missing was this in the startup.cs. We need to tell it to use our controllers and our endpoints. So a couple ways we can do that in our startup.cs file. Remember, our startup.cs file exists to register all of our middleware and everything that we want the application to know about as it starts up. So essentially between the anything between the ASP.NET IIS that has running to our controllers is all configured in our startup.cs. So if I go into one of my projects that I'm currently working on, I believe it's this one, and we go to a startup.cs, which is here, you can see that we have a couple things that tells the program that we're using, not only are we using MVC or the model view controller pattern, which we can see here. So I'm adding controllers with views. And if you hover over it, it says add services for controllers to the specified iService collection. So this is where it tells it that it's using the MVC pattern, and then you should also look in your views folder to find a corresponding view with that controller. And then next, what we need to do is we need to use routing. So we're going to be using routing to route to those controllers and their corresponding actions. So we can use this app.useRouting. This is considered an extension method. If you look here, it says extension. So this is an extension to the iApplication Builder interface. And that extension is given to us via the ASP.NET Core framework. So in order to use this routing, you must also be using the namespace for ASP.NET Core. And you can see here, I believe it's in hosting. It might be in Builder as well. If you comment it out, it should tell you where that extension method comes from. All right, that's iApplication Builder, so it probably is in this hosting namespace. Maybe not. Where else could it be? No, it could be in the hosting extensions. That would make sense. It has to be in one of these. Let's just comment everything out. It has to be in one of these 5. All right, anyways. Putting everything back in. So this use routing is probably exists in whichever one broke this iApplication Builder is probably in the ASP.NET .builder namespace that we're using at the top. The next thing we want to do is the app.use endpoint. So you can see I actually have something commented out here. So what endpoint that I have by default registered is this map controller route. So endpoints, you can see here app.use endpoint. So this is another extension off of the iApplication Builder. And then we can add endpoints to our controller actions. So we can use our URLs to call actions within our controllers, and then it injects in here using dependency injection, which we will cover later on in the course. But just know the framework sees that this is an iEndpoint route builder type, and then based on that type, it knows what to inject in at runtime, and it does that because it's built into the .NET framework, the .NET Core framework, that whenever somebody calls upon this type, to go ahead and inject it into the constructor for this use endpoints. Okay, so based on that, we can then start configuring our endpoints. So endpoints.mapControllerRoute, and what that's going to do is map our controller routes to our endpoints. So we have routes or actions on our controller. I'm going to go ahead and give one the default, or this is the one it's going to use essentially by default. This is the default controller action. And the pattern I want to use for the default action, first I want to, obviously the first part of your URL is going to be, www.mywebsite.com. So you could have something here, www.mywebsite.com. And then after that, you have how you want to map to your controller actions. So this is just implied because you're already on the root of your website. And then after you're on the root of your website, then we want to use the controller equal to home. So if you don't put anything after the root of your website, you just go to www.mywebsite.com. By default, the pattern I want to use the home controller. On the home controller, I want to use the index action. And then, so this action is optional. So if they don't include the action, it knows to go to index. And then we're also given an optional ID. So maybe you're not in home, maybe you're in some other controller that has an action that's maybe list or something like that, and maybe at list you want to send an ID of the ID of the list in the list that you want to view. So this is just a default action. You can add more endpoints to this as well. We're not going to for this right now, but you can add more endpoints as you see fit based on different patterns that the chapter goes through. But that is how we register our default action. So, and what I have commented out here, if I uncomment this, and then I can comment this, so control, oops, what's going on here? So if I comment this out, control K, control C, and we hover over this map default route controller, essentially this does the same thing as the below piece of code does. So the code below is a little bit more explicit. It tells you exactly what you want everything to be named. This actually does it for you, and it maps the default controller route to controller equals home, action equals index, with an optional ID parameter to get passed into that index action, or whichever action you choose here to go to after the home route. So you can simply put in this line of code here that'll put in this line of code for you, or you can do this code to be a little bit more explicit, and it also defines it a bit better, and then you can also use this for other endpoints as well. Okay, so now going back to our PowerPoint. So that is our startup.cs, explains a little bit how we're going to use our routing and route our URL endpoints to our controller actions. This shows the use routing method that I called along with my use endpoints extension method to define exactly how we're going to use our default route to map to our endpoints, which I will demonstrate in Visual Studio here in a minute. This shows our configure services method, which is where we did all that. Here's the code that we put in there. So hopefully my explanation suffice to explain exactly what this was doing. This shows the endpoints.map default controller route that takes the place of this app.use endpoints and then the endpoints.map controller route. So you can use either one of those to solve the same problem. So here is essentially that URL segment that I showed earlier. Remember, this is your https://www.mywebsite.com. But the mywebsite.com, if you're running it locally, is just going to say localhost and then what port that we're currently using. So whenever you run your application, you see this localhost :5001, and essentially that's just saying this website is running on my local machine, and it's running on port 5001. So if you remember, if we go back to networking and exactly what ports do, the most common port for HTTP is 80, and then for SSL it's 443. But since we're running our local machine and those ports are being used for actual HTTP, we're just mapping to 5001 on our local machine for your local host. Okay, so here's the pattern for the default route that we talked about already. The controller is home. So the first segment specifies the controller that we're trying to route to. So you can have more than one controller in your application, and you can have more than one action on your controller. So if you can have your index action, which is just essentially your home page action or what action you want to get by default. Or you can have other actions like /home/about. So if you have an about page that you want to have that kind of corresponds to your home page. So you typically want to group all of your common actions together. So home, you want to have all of your kind of stuff that's more generic, maybe just more content related. You have paragraphs and p tags, but then maybe you want another controller that all it does is control maybe stuff that comes from your database. So it could have items from your database. You could list out items. You could list specific items from a database. So you can have multiple controllers, and each controller should be segmented out in a logical manner. So hopefully this next slide will kind of better define what I'm talking about. So here we have our local host, or www.mywebsite.com. And then from there we can break out into our controllers. So our home controller, we have an about, or we have an index action, which essentially is our home page. Or we can have an about action, which could be an about page or about us. You know, it could be about the company, about your company, about the people that work at your company, about yourself, if it's a website about yourself. So we have all of those things that could exist in our home controller, and then we have a product controller that deals with everything that we want with products. So if we have maybe a website that sells musical instruments, so if we're talking about amusiciansfriend.com or Sam Ash or Guitar Center, they might have a product controller that we route to display all of our products. So then we can maybe display a list of guitars. So then we can go to our products controller that controls all of our products. And then we have a list route that lists the products. And then what product exactly do we want to list? We want to list guitars. And then maybe we have a product detail route that will detail exactly a detail about a guitar. So maybe how many strings it has, the type of wood it's made out of, the brand. If it's drums, maybe the brand of drums, what type of heads the drums have or whatever. So those are the controllers and their exact actions, and then you can see how that pattern is used with this controller action ID table that exists here on the right. So we have our local host, and you can see based on the pattern, by default, if we go to our website, if we go to the home of our website, it'll put in home for us, since that is our default controller, default action, and then the ID is null. So then if we go to /home, the default action is index. Then if we go to /home/index, so you notice these all kind of map to the same page or the same action. Next, we have /home/about, and you can see we explicitly said we want to go to the home controller and the about action, so it's going to look for a method called about. We have a product controller, so it's going to go to that product controller. And then since we have our index action as the default, it'll default to that index action. We have a product list, so it's going to go to the product controller. It's going to find a method called list. It's going to go to the product controller, find a method called list, and pass it guitars into that method. Lastly, we're going to go to a product controller. We're going to go to a detail method. And then since we didn't pass anything, it'll pass in 0 since it's an integer. And then it'll pass in 3 since that's used as a parameter here. So here we have that as well. So here we have a home controller that inherits from controller, so an MVC controller. And then based on that index action or that about action, instead of returning a view, we're just returning content. So you can return a view, which will return an HTML result, or you can just return content just to show us exactly how this routing is working, which we'll do here in a second in Visual Studio. Okay, and here's our list in detail. There's some more stuff with the product controller. You can see you can also have, so we have our product controller, we have our list method, and we want to list all of the products, but maybe just page 1. So you can have routes that keep going on and on. Usually with the way websites are now, usually there's just like pagination or endless scrolling to where you just keep scrolling down and it keeps putting on pages instead of going through like this pagination. Here's how you would do that in your list. So here's you have your category and your page number. So you can see we can put anything that we want to insert into this action after our method as a parameter into our method here. So anything after your action, you just put into your method parameters. Here's different routing patterns mapped to controllers. So you always start with your most specific route. So here we have our controller. So it could be our home controller and our action. And we have an optional ID. And then we have what page that we want to show and then how we want that list to be sorted. So that's our most specific. Notice if we don't want to sort by, we can just give it a page. And then notice our least specific route is going to be our default route. So we can have our default route. We have a route that we can use for paging. So we have our controller action ID page. And we have a more specific route than that with 5 required segments where we have our controller action ID and then the page that we want to see and then how we want that page to be sorted. So that's different ways we can use our routes to route to more specific controller actions than just this default one. But more often than not, our default route is all you'll need for a generic website. All right, here's some more page routing you can look through in the PowerPoint. And here is attribute routing. Map controllers, which I think I'll just cover inside of Visual Studio. Okay, so let's go to Visual Studio now. So here I have my website. I'll go ahead and run it just to show you. It goes just to a home page right now. It's loading. All right, here's my home page, building web apps with ASP.NET Core. That's all it does right now. If I go to /home, I think I might have changed it a little bit, so it's not going to go to a /home/index action. Okay. So let's actually go back and map some things to our actions here in Visual Studio. So here's my home controller, and you can see I put a route here attribute on there. So let's take this route attribute off, and I'll explain what that does here in a second. So now that I took that route attribute off, let me go ahead and start up my application again. Okay, so now we're back on our home page. We go to /home. It's spinning. So now we're at /home/home/index. And you can see no matter what URL I put in there, it still routes to the same page. It still returns the same view once I took that route attribute off. So let's try to add a controller and map it to a different route. So what I have is, I have this hooked up to a database that lists out items for a game that I play. So I go out to a repository to get all of the items, which I'll go over in a later video, the repository pattern. But essentially, I go out to a repository to get the items. So I have another project that goes out to a repository. We can see here that the first thing I try to do is I try to get it from a web service I created. So I reach out to a proxy project that I have created also. So I reach out to a proxy. So you can see here I go to an HTTP client to get my items. Don't worry too much about this. I'm just showing you how I'm getting the items right now to display on a web page. You're not going to have a web service to get your items from. You're just getting your items from straight from your database for your final project or whatever. But what I do have, if I don't have it running locally, if I don't have my web service running locally, which I have over here, here's my web service that I have running. But it's not running right now, so what it will do is it will try to reach out to the proxy to get the items. It'll time out because I don't have it running. So then it'll reach my catch, and it'll catch an exception. I could probably have it catch a more specific exception, like a timeout exception or something like that. I could see exactly what exception occurred to make this a bit more specific. But since I'm just going to catch pretty much anything that could go wrong, and if anything goes wrong trying to reach out to my proxy, what I do is I just go ahead and try to get it from my database context. So essentially, if I'm too lazy to have my web service running, just go ahead and I have an Entity Framework project that I have within this. If we go to my .database project here, which will then reach out to my database locally to grab that information if I don't start up my web service. So I want to have a controller that I'm going to display the items from my database or my web service. So I'm going to make a specific controller to do that. That really doesn't fall within my home controller realm of what it should worry about. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new controller. So if you're in Visual Studio, what you can do to make a new controller is you can right-click on your controller's project, and then you can click Add New Item, and then click Add Controller, and then give the controller a name. So it's pretty easy to do in Visual Studio. It's a little bit harder to do in Visual Studio Code. You have to give it a little bit more. So in Visual Studio Code, you actually have to create a new file. So I'm going to create a new file here. I want to call this file items plural controller. I'm going to give it a .cs extension for C#. Hit enter. And now I have a blank items controller file. So if you were in Visual Studio, if you click on New Controller, it'd give you a namespace, give you the controller name. It would already probably inherit from the correct controller base. So since we're in VS Code, it's not going to give us that much. So I'm going to go ahead and put a namespace in here. You can see my home controller is already in the namespace of com.diablo2.controllers. Usually that's how you name everything. You name it backwards from your URL. So if my URL is say diablo2.com, you could say com.diablo2.controllers. So that's what namespace I'll be putting this in. So com, and it'll give me some auto completion. Yep, that's my project and the folder that exists within my project, controllers. That's typically how namespaces are built within C# or within MVC specifically. So usually you have your project and then what folder that exists within your project, and that's how you pick your namespace name usually. So now that we have that, we want to make public class, and then we'll want to say whatever we had here for our name for our file, so items controller. Now what MVC does is it takes the name controller off of your controller and then sees what the name of the controller is based on how it's prefixed from controller. So it's a little bit cryptic in the way it figures out what controller to call. So let's just say controller. We'll go ahead and give it some opening and curly braces. So now we have our class. And then anytime we make a class that's a controller, what we want to do is inherit from controller. And what that does is it says that this is now an ASP.NET Core MVC controller, and it'll exist within that pattern that we used in our startup.cs, and it will look for this controller now whenever the framework looks for actions. So you can see when I inherit from controller, I can control period, and then it will show our using statements for our controller actions. So using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC, which is what we want to do. And you can see once I did that, it put this using statement at the top here. All right, so now we have an items controller. So the next thing you usually want to do whenever you create a new controller is you want to create a views folder for that as well. So I'm going to go ahead to my views folder, create a new folder inside of that called items. So now I have an items folder, and then within that items folder, I'm going to create a new file called index.cshtml. So here's our CSHTML file that will, whenever we go to this items controller, and then we direct maybe to an index action, so public I action result of index, we can go ahead and return view. So what that'll do is, notice it says return view, or it'll return a view result. So it'll say I'm in the items controller. So since I'm in the items controller, what I want to do is I want to go to the views folder. Since it says return view, it'll go to the views folder. It'll look for a folder called items since it corresponds to the items controller. And then it'll look for an index.cshtml file since index is the default action or the default name for a CSHTML file to return that view. All right. So now different actions we can take within our controller. Instead of returning a view, I'm just going to return content since I don't really feel like creating a view. So return content. And the returning a content result will basically just return a string of content that you want to display on the web page. So what I want to display here is I'm going to say items controller index action. Okay, so we have controller here. I was going to mention another thing we can inherit from as well as controller base. And controller base is what you want to inherit from, but controller base does not offer view support. So controller base is basically just used for web services. So if you're just going to return JSON or just return data to a calling service, you can inherit from controller base. But since we want view support, we want to inherit from controller. And you can see controller is a base class for MVC controller with view support. So view support, you use controller. For a web service or without view support, you can use controller base. So we'll have this action. Let's also make another action by action result. Let's make a list action, and we'll give it an ID for what we want to list. And then we'll return again content to display on our web page to show that we are in the right controller. And we'll say items controller list action ID equals ID. Let's do the same thing for index as well. Let's give index ID equals all. Okay, so now we have our items controller. Let's go ahead and run it and see if we can map to those actions. All right, so here we're still on our home controller. Since we didn't give it any, it's just currently using the default pattern. So what I want to do is I want to map to /items, which should map to my index action. So you notice here that I have my items controller and my index action, and I have all as the ID. So you can see that it took my ID, and it's currently just using this as the default since I didn't pass one. But I can pass an ID that I maybe want to just see /items / what's certain items, pole arms. Oh, I didn't like that. ID equals all. Let's see if I can set a breakpoint. Oh, probably because I'm running. All right, so I have a breakpoint. /items / you might not like it because it's the index action. Let's see if it goes there. /items / pole arms. All right, so yeah, it's not even mapping to this. So here's a list. Let's go ahead and stop it. Let's take this out. Let's instead put string type equals all. All right, so we want to list all by default, or we can list a certain type. Let's see if we can get it routing to here. All right, so we wanted to go to /items, so we're going to our items controller /list. So here we're listing all, and then let's go to /polearms. Still all. Why doesn't it like that? Type equals all. Let's remove this breakpoint. slash items slash list. So where are we at? I think it stopped here. Let's F10. Type is all. Type is all. Let's go to slash list slash polearms. I'm still saying type is all. Let's go ahead and stop. Okay, let's try to change this to ID. I think because in the pattern I have this named ID, I think I have to stick to that name. So let's stop running it. And let's try to run it again. Let's again go to slash items slash list slash polearms. And I still have a breakpoint set. So now we can see that if I wanted to list by polearms, I could do that. I needed the word ID. I think I changed the name to type. And I don't have type in the pattern, so I don't think it knew what to do with that past ID. Okay, so we can see that I'm mapping to controllers and the specific actions. And it found that the list action because the list action was named list in my controller. So we can also override those actions. So we saw that I could go to slash home slash index, and that would return my index action in my home controller. Maybe I don't want that slash home slash index. Maybe I just want to override that to only go there on the home page or only on www.mywebsite.com. Maybe I don't want slash home slash index to go anywhere. So what I can do is I can put route attributes on my routes, and I can use those to essentially override that pattern that I have in the endpoints object, or that endpoints startup.cs file. So now I can route to essentially whenever I go to this home index action or whenever someone goes to the root of my website, I want to go here. And I can also do that. Let's go ahead and make an about. So I have error. Let's go ahead and make a public action result about. I'll return content about. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. So now I can go to slash home slash index, and now you notice it doesn't route anywhere. So we kind of overrode this to say we only want to go to that action only if they're on the root of the website. So now let's go to slash home slash about. And now you can see we're going to the about web page. So if we go back, we can see that my action result of about, it found that this method was called about, and I want to go to the about web page, or we can return a view that is the about view if you had a about.cs HTML inside of this home folder. So what else we can do is if we don't want to go to slash home slash about, maybe we just want to go to about slash about. We can do a route attribute here, and we can say that we want to just route to about. So we don't want to, we're on the root of the website, and now we want to route to about. So let's go ahead and stop running it, start running it again. And now when we did go to slash home slash about, Now that doesn't route anywhere. Now we can just go to /about, and that now routes to our about web page. So if you want to override how your routes are being routed to, or how your actions are being routed to, you can use the route attribute. And you can use the route attribute anywhere. You can use it on your controllers. You can use it on your actions. You can see in the PowerPoint, you can do things such as routing. Where is it? Here's what we just did with the root of the website or the about page. Here's different ways you can route to products, to a category, or to an ID. What I wanted to show was, okay, so here we can route. So here's the code for the products controller. So there's a product controller. And then we have the route being retail controller action ID. So we can also put words in front of our URLs as well. So we can have www.mywebsite.com/retail/products. So maybe these are just retail products. And then we can see whenever we try to route to it in our browser, we need to type in retail before the controller action. So those are other ways we can use the route attributes to force a pattern in our URLs. There's also, at the end of the PowerPoint, best practices for URLs. URLs are very important for websites. Each website has their own URL patterns. If you're using something like Google, they have their own kind of patterns where they have like calendar.google.com or store.google.com. So they always have their portion of their website, or maybe you could call it their controllers of their website, prefixed. And that seems to be a pretty common theme with websites nowadays. Maybe Amazon doesn't do it. Amazon might go to amazon.com/ whatever kind of products they use. But each different website has their own ways they use their URLs. You can see that the best practices, number one, is be consistent. So if someone wants to use their website and they don't really know how to navigate the website just by using the URL, typically that is a pretty big turnoff for people to use your website. They don't really know what to type in. They have to try to click around and navigate it. Typically people that are a little bit more computer savvy get the hang of it eventually to where they can just use the URL patterns. Create an intuitive hierarchy, which kind of goes along with being consistent. If I ever go to any Google apps that I use, I can go to docs.google.com or something like that, and I know exactly where it's going to take me. And the last part of the lecture covers areas. So we're not going to cover areas in this course, but you can feel free to add an area to your web page just to mess around with it. Areas are ways to segment parts, or basically make subsites within your site using an area. So maybe if you're doing a final project using your ASP.NET Core MVC, maybe for senior design or something like that, what you can do is make an admin area for people that administer your website to come in and maybe add products to your website or something like that. And you basically make a website inside of your website. And you can do that using areas. You can also register your areas inside of your endpoint. So you can see here we made an endpoint for our area. Area name is admin, and it's prefixed with admin controller home index ID. So you can see that we're just essentially making another website inside of our website, and then we also have an entire folder structure within our website as well. So if you're interested in using areas in your website, you can also register your areas with attributes. If you're interested in doing that, you can feel free to do it, but it won't be a requirement to do in this class. But they are pretty cool to use when you're making admin sites and stuff like that to administer your website. So that is routing in ASP.NET Core MVC. Make sure to practice on your own, make more controllers in your site, make that default controller action or default route in your website. And I hope this helps. So have a good week.